One thing that I'm taking to heart in the midst of these unusual circumstances is God's concern for his people when they are suffering and his active participation in their affliction. And that should be comforting to us because I think for Christians, sometimes it can be particularly hard when we are suffering because we know that God is sovereign. We know he's in control. And we can trust, based on Romans 8:28, that for those who love God, God is working all things together for good in their lives. So we can trust that if God is allowing something that is difficult, that it will bring about good results. But if God is sovereign and he's allowing these things, the question is, how does he feel when we're going through this suffering, even though he knows it's going to bring about this good result? I think the Old Testament gives us a really good explanation of this through the suffering of the Israelites in the land of Egypt. You see, God declared beforehand that this would happen. In Genesis 15:13, God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years." So God tells Abram, almost immediately after he tells him he's going to have these numerous descendants, that these descendants are going to go into a land that is not their own, and they're going to suffer tremendously. So God knows this is going to happen. He makes it clear to us that it's going to happen to the Israelites. And yet, this is what God says when he appears to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus 3. The Lord said, after the 400 years of suffering, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering." So he shows Moses that he is the God who hears, who sees, and who knows about their suffering. So he shows Moses that he is the God who hears, who sees, and who is aware of their suffering. And if the scripture stopped there in its description of God, that would be comforting, to know that he hears and he sees, that he's not far off. And yet, the scripture in its description of God goes even further than this. In Exodus 4, verse 31, after Moses tells the Israelites about God and his interaction with him that he has just had, it says the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about the sons of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, then they bowed low and worshiped. So he's not just the God who sees, who hears, and who is aware of, but he is concerned with their affliction. And this causes the Israelites to bow down and worship. And so too should we, knowing that God is concerned for us when we suffer. In one final passage in Isaiah 63, verse 9, when the prophet Isaiah describes this period of time in Egypt, he says this: "In all their affliction, he was afflicted." So when the Israelites were suffering, so was God. Even though he allowed this to happen so that it would bring about a good result, when they suffered, it caused him to suffer. And so too, when we suffer, though God has allowed it for a good reason, he suffers alongside us. He is not a far-off, passive observer. No. He is an active participant in our suffering. So as you're going through this difficult time, remember that. God is not far off. He is near. He is not unaware of your suffering. He knows. He has not covered his eyes and his ears. He sees and he hears. And he can understand because he too is afflicted when you are afflicted.